Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Nick, for coming on this episode. It's a real pleasure to have you on. I know you
Sure,
probably
happy to
have a
be
lot
here.
of yeah. I know you probably have a lot of views and opinions. Um, to give context, Nick's an economist at Khazanah. He's a director of investments, and he
Research.
sorry, director of research. Yeah, and he's very well versed with, I guess, what's happening in the economy and its effects. So I just wanted to start with your general view on where we're heading as a global economy, and then more specifically where Malaysia fits into that whole movement.
Okay. So I think overall, um, pretty clear that the global economy is going to head for um, a recession, at least this year, and really depending on when, if at all, a vaccine happens, potentially next year as well. I am somebody who's a bit more bearish, I think, than the average commentator out there. I think this thing can go on for a long time because SARS and MERS, we don't have a vaccine yet, right?
Mhm.
And so there's no reason to assume right now that we are going to find a vaccine for COVID-19. So if we don't, then a lot of the measures that we see now, especially on social distancing and all, will have to be kept up until A, a vaccine is found, which if I'm not positive about it, then B, you have some form of herd immunity. Now, and on that front, what would that mean for the economy? Well, I think, assuming that public health systems are sustainable, meaning that, you can take in the number of cases. So the health policy part should come first in thinking of all of this. But if you look at about how the economy is going to go, assuming, that you don't have very severe lockdowns anymore, um, it's not clear to me that consumer behavior will resume. I think one thing you can look at, right, a parameter that's really important to all of this is actually the job resumption rate. Just because you reopen the economy doesn't mean the economy goes back to normal. So in China, in Wuhan specifically, industrials returned back to work pretty quickly, like nearly full capacity. But services resumed much more slowly, to only about 82% of where it was before. And this happens for a few reasons, SMEs might close their business because they don't have enough cash to survive the lockdown, or consumer behavior changes, people might not want to go out anymore, or the government still bans certain social activities like cinemas and so on. So that job resumption rate will really determine how well the economy can come back. It is not clear to me that, or rather we should not assume that it'll be anywhere close to 100% just because there are going to be some behavioral changes that come out of it.
And with the whole SME thing, which is a big issue in Malaysia, I guess, because a large percentage of our GDP is SME, and on top of that, more than 60% of our GDP is from the services industry.
Yeah.
How is the government going to be able to get that resumption rate high enough to a point where most people are
Well,
not affected?
sure. So some things are within the control of government, some are not, right? The choice of whether just because you open cinemas again, the government cannot compel me to go back and watch a movie in the cinema. So there are some things it can control, some things it can't. But in terms of support for SMEs, I think what the government has done so far is on the right track. Could it do more as the situation gets worse? Possibly, and it might have to. But if you look at some of the stuff it's done on the wage support scheme, on the loan moratoriums, on some of these convertible grants, things like that are useful. You could argue that maybe could have been a bit more. Of course, there are fiscal constraints and so on. And you could argue that maybe those fiscal constraints shouldn't be constraints in the time of crisis.
Yeah.
But I think that whatever's been done is on the right track, and they still should keep monitoring to see if there's more that still needs to be done. Because the thing that you also don't want to do, right? I actually am in favor of expanding the fiscal deficit more. I think this is not the time to worry necessarily about whether it's going to be like 5.2 or 5.5, just go up. But what you want to be careful about is also too much discretionary spending and setting a bad precedent for the future. We need to be careful about that. But you might have to increase the deficit further depending on how the economic situation goes.
So I heard an interesting take on Bloomberg a few days ago about the way in which fiscal and monetary policy is dealing with this. Um,
Okay.
and what I heard was that America's pursuing, if you looked at game theory, a one-shot game at their response to the pandemic, is going all in at the start with their massive stimulus, about 30-something% of your GDP. And I was just wondering why Malaysia's taken a much more um, maybe multi-level game approach to it.
Sure, but because I think one thing you have to understand is that the U.S. Federal Reserve can essentially print nearly as much money as it wants and it's fine. Countries like Japan, like the U.S., the Eurozone to an extent, developed markets which have uh, very strong positions as reserve currencies or as currencies which people use for trade can do that because the demand for that currency is always going to be there. Malaysia prints too much, and people might not want the exchange rate, and might not want the currency anymore in your exchange rate tax. The U.S. There's a lot of proponents of just printing money and printing, but actually, it is possible only for very specific countries. It does not apply to nearly every other country in the world. So the US can do that simply because it can't print all the money it can from the start. Malaysia has taken a more measured approach because we can't do that. So we kind of have to see, all right, we do this. Let's see how it goes. If it's enough, it's not enough, we might have to look at it again. But we don't have the capacity to just go a big shot because what if it's not enough?
Yeah.
Then we have to look at different sources later.
So in that light, I suppose Malaysia should also probably be looking at their revenue generation and how they can fund, this
Sure.
this expansionary policy. And I think one of the problems that we're looking at today is the massive plummet in oil prices and the foreseeable future of low oil prices. I was just wondering if you had a view on that, maybe on the future of prices and how it's going to affect the economy.
Yeah. So if you look at, the reason why oil prices plunge is really a demand factor driven by COVID, lockdowns and things like that. As more countries around the world reopen the economy, oil prices should go back up a little bit. But of course, all this is dependent on whether there's a deal between Russia and Saudi Arabia on oil and whether they get that done. But the thing to keep in mind is that the WTI price crash because of the specific type of contract it was. But it really is a demand issue more than anything. If demand picks back up as countries start to reopen their economy, then oil should normalize a little bit. But of course, it is a problem for Malaysia because oil prices matter for the budget and for revenue. But I don't think, in my view, I don't think that you can decouple COVID-19 responses the governments are taking right now with oil prices because of the demand drop that most of these lockdowns impose.
And if you look at the domestic economy, so our oil revenue gives us a lot of subsidies for domestic consumption. And I was just wondering, with the massive plummet in domestic consumption we're seeing now, what does the future look like for SMEs and for just general employment?
In the immediate future, not great. Obviously, some of the numbers we've seen, unemployment, number of jobs, I think in Malaysia, they just released a number today for March. It's a very high number. Unemployment is at its highest since 2010. And that doesn't include April numbers. Yeah, and that doesn't include April numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be very tough. And the economy is one of those reinforcing things. If people spend, then businesses make money. If people don't spend, businesses don't make money, and then they cannot pay people and so on. So I think the immediate outlook is not great. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, when we look at our domestic big institutions like for example, Khazanah, our sovereign wealth fund, and then we look at our big commercial banks, how do you gauge, or what do you think of the health of these institutions in the next few years?
Banks should be okay. They'll probably take some hit on their P&L because of the loan moratorium, and if they can't, charge the interest, then yeah, they'll take some hits. But I'm not too worried about the financial stability. The NPLs, or they'll be okay. There's a lot of room there. A lot of these institutions, the financial institutions, won't suffer too much because of what the US has done, which is again another flood of liquidity global markets, because financial assets receive those benefits a lot quicker than real assets. And a lot of people are saying that the US hasn't priced in what's happening with the economy. The S&P, for example, hasn't priced in what's happening in the real economy. But it could also just be that like there's a new flush of liquidity and it's being used to support markets. So it's not that it hasn't been priced in, it's just that it's been counterbalanced by all of this. So the companies that engage in financial investment with money like that floating around generally will do okay, because then you're just keeping them afloat. But the money has to go somewhere, right? So that's why they'll be okay.
Yeah, so maybe we should talk a little bit more about the securities in the US. I hear a lot of claims that it's practically a zombie market right now because of the amount of liquidity that the Fed has pumped in. And I was just wondering, does that have impacts on Malaysian companies with holdings, or Malaysians with holdings in those securities?
Well, the immediate thing is if the money goes in to support, the market and keeps the valuations what they are, then yeah, they'll be okay. But long term, it creates basically overinflated asset prices relative to the fundamentals, just because the money has to go somewhere. So maybe in the long term doesn't work out as much, and if you can sell off your position quicker, sure. But we've learned from the 2008 financial crisis that there's a lot of liquidity that just floods everywhere just because it has to go somewhere, and they lead to really bull market runs on share prices which do not necessarily match fundamentals.
Just out of curiosity, do you think that the resurgence since March is permanent? Or?
I'm not the type who can really like predict where markets are going to go. It's all sentiment. I mean, markets are greed and fear, sentiment driven. And it's hard to say where they're going to go next month if something else happens.
Okay.
I mean, it's like this time last year, you would have predicted the world is where it is now, right? So I think markets are even harder to predict.
And okay, so coming back to Malaysia, I wanted to talk to you about supply chains and how that's going to affect our local businesses. So we do a lot of manufacturing of electronics. There seems to be, in a post-COVID world, this shift towards a more deglobalized economy. And I was just wondering, how can Malaysia take advantage of that based on the fact that a lot of our exports fit into this global supply chain?
Yeah. So I don't necessarily know whether the world will be more deglobalized, because the thing that we see is that Japan is trying to pay its companies to relocate out of China, but it doesn't mean relocate back into Japan. For one, economic factors will still matter in terms of the cost of doing business at some of these places. But also, I think big companies may want to consider diversification. You pay a bit more to diversify your risk so that your supply chain doesn't get shut down. We saw this actually when Thailand had its floods, and a lot of the electronics industry, the car industries were affected by it. So I think countries may look even more now to diversifying, and if Malaysia can catch some of those reshoring that the companies are doing, then you can bring in some FDI. But I hope that they're judicious about what type of FDI they bring in. You shouldn't. I mean, there's FDI, and you want to make sure that you get the latter.
And if you look at Malaysian companies right now, I think the big thing that Khazanah has a vested interest in is Malaysia Airlines. So I was just wondering what your opinion was on the airline industry, and then AirAsia, Malaysia Airlines specifically.
Yeah, so the airline industry everywhere, you can see, there are bankruptcies coming of that, and it's really hard to tell because, when it's ever going to pick up because of the way that COVID will change the nature of how travel works. So one is, why would I travel anywhere if I have to be quarantined 2 weeks and then after that only I get to go out? But the other is, even if you live the quarantine and you practice social distancing on airplanes, that means that airplanes will never be at full capacity again. What does that mean for your ticket prices and who can fly? For low cost carriers, you're playing really the volume game, where you try to get a lot of people on your flights. But if you can't do that anymore, what does that mean for your business? So I think airlines are probably the toughest industry to be in right now, because at least with hotels, you can repurpose them into like quarantine centers or something like that. But airlines just really hard, and you see a lot of you see airlines around the world doing a lot of very drastic measures. Some have closed down, and some are putting staff on paid leave, and so it's just a really tough time for
And,
airlines everywhere.
and so I guess Malaysia Airlines and AirAsia just have to ride the wave. But do you think they have the liquidity or like the cash reserves to be able to do so?
Well, but there's a broader strategy question here. I mean, one thing is whether they have the reserves or not, but it's more the what are you going to do if social distancing makes there's a broader existential question, which is what are you going to do when social distancing means that you might not be able to fly at full capacity?
Yeah.
And how does that impact your pricing? How does that impact uh, uh, the other costs that you want to add on and stuff like that?
Yeah. So I guess with with airlines, it's just a waiting game, and it comes back to the vaccine and being able to get people immune to it before they return.
And I don't even think that. And like I said earlier, we shouldn't assume that there will necessarily be a vaccine. We don't know.
And so now I want to move on to opening the economy, because I think that's a reoccurring theme all around the world, whether prematurely or not. My first question is, do you think Malaysia, the government, were right to reopen? And why do you think that there's been this conflict between states and the federal government?
So in terms of reopening the economy, right, because the reason you do a movement control order or any kind of lockdown or whatever is not to get cases back to zero. You can't. That's not possible. You just need one, and then you shut down the economy. The point is to make sure that your public health system has the capacity to take on cases as they come up. And this could be measured in terms of number of beds, measured in terms of number of ICUs or ventilators, whatever. But you need to make sure that your public health has the capacity to deal with, new cases when they come up. So that really is the purpose of a movement control order, not to get cases down to zero or even single digits. The right measure should be, active case, for example, active cases per number of beds, or ICU cases per number of ICU, and something like that. Because the thing is, even if you have single digit cases, right, for every, like 30 days in a row, let's say, where you have, let's say, 9 new cases every day, but only 5 people being released every day, you still have 4 net active cases. That's not good, right? What you actually want is the reduction in active cases. So if you look at that, Malaysia has done a fairly good job in reducing the active cases, right? And there is capacity. I think the Director General of Health, Dr. Noisham, did say that the maximum capacity at Malaysia's peak was about 30+%. If that's the case, then there's capacity, and then you need to balance against, okay, if we have capacity and we are more targeted about where we are going to test and trace and so on, then how do we then balance that against the fact that there's livelihoods at stake by keeping the economy closed? So, on that basis, I generally think actually that for any country that has confidence in its public health system to take on new cases and to maintain, maintain a good amount of capacity, it should keep the economy open. Yes, it's true that you probably see new cases and all that kind of stuff, but again, the point is not to have 0 new cases. The point is to make sure you have public health capacity.
So, I mean, if we can deal with, public health and being able to operate at maybe a 30 or 40% capacity throughout this pandemic, the another important question is, once you open, how do you shift the sentiment within people? Because I think a lot of people are fearful or do not properly understand the nature of the virus, so are less inclined to return to life as normal. So how does the government go about, instituting normality?
Well, the thing is, I don't know what reinstituting normality might mean, because part of what normality is now is that we have to still practice a lot of social distancing. We still have to maintain really strict hygiene practices. We have to maintain a lot of safety protocols in workspaces or even in public spaces, public transport, and so on. So I think that part doesn't go away, and it'd be remiss for the government to say, "Oh, we can do like what we did in the past." Can't do that anymore anyway. You can't have mass gatherings. You can't do all that stuff. So I think that it's hard to say, whether the government can tell people that, oh, we're going, no, because I don't really think it works that way. I think we need a bit of a healthy fear, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, by people that there is always a chance that this thing could really spread like wildfire again. So then people behave appropriately given the circumstances. I don't know if I want to say that we should go to zero fear actually.
Mm-hmm. And on sentiment, I was wondering if you had any insights into how consumer sentiment's changing in terms of where they're spending their money and the effects on local businesses or domestic businesses versus shopping online.
So there was a report that just came out today, released by the Department of Statistics, that tries to address some of these questions that you just asked.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, let me just check. They do address some of these things quite well. Let me just pull it up quickly. Yeah, so a lot of the companies actually said that they didn't have any income during EMCO because they couldn't go online, they couldn't do all of that. And it's not clear that these companies, if they couldn't do it during MCO, why they would be able to do it now. So that shift towards the more online approach might not also work from a supply demand point of view. And consumer behavior is also very, very hard to predict because there was a case in China where they swarmed the touristy site after the economy was allowed to open, and in South Korea now they have a hashtag which is like revenge shopping. And
Interesting. I've not heard of this.
yeah, you can check it out. It's really hard to say how people react.
And so finally, I'd just like to ask you if you have any other thoughts you'd like to share, any insights or any feelings about the future.
You know, I think that people should buckle in. It's going to be a very rough year and rough 2-3 years maybe, and we should help each other where we can. If you have more that you can share it, give, and help your community as best as you can. I'm, the government needs to do its job, but I'm not the type of person who would recommend someone to just rely on the government. I think that we need to help each other as best as we can. So I'm very encouraged by some of the community movements that have sprung up during this really difficult period, and that should be highlighted, encouraged, and people should do more of it.
And finally, before we end, have you been reading any interesting books or articles that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'm reading a new book now. I can show you. It's called Until the End of Time by Brian Greene. Mind, Matter, and Our Search for Meaning in an Evolving Universe. So check it out now. The first 4 or 5 chapters are quite good. So
cool. Thanks for coming on, Nick.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Take
care of each other. All right. See ya.